the recent seminar organized by the School of Biosciences, Pune University. It gives us immense pleasure to introduce the guest of honor, Dr. Shekhar Mande, who is an eminent scientist and excellent science manager and administrator. Dr. Shekhar began his scientific career at Intech Chandigarh. From there, he moved to CDFD as a scientist and later as Dean Academics. He also served as a director in CSIR Pune. Dr. Mande led Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, that is CSIR, as a DG, and he shouldered immense responsibilities, especially during the pandemic. Dr. Mande is known for his research work on redox proteins, hitch-up proteins, and computational biology of mycobacterium tuberculosis. He is awarded with Shanti Swarup Nagar Award, and he is a fellow in various scientific bodies in India. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. I welcome you to talk.
Thank you, Shubha. I think it's probably not working. Hello. No, I don't think it's working. Hello. I think something. I'll speak on that. Give me the other mic. I can. Yeah, thank you, Shubha. Thank you, Subramania. Subramania and I have known each other since his PhD days. I was his senior, but I'm not going to share any stories from our student days. They are not generally, they are interesting stories, but not to be shared in the public. But nonetheless, thank you, Subramania, for inviting me here for this talk. I was told it's mostly biology audience, but are there people also from apart from biology, some other departments? Okay, I'll keep the hope I will keep the level to a level in which everyone will be able to get some message out of the talk. Now, my idea for giving this kind of a talk arose last year. All of you are aware that there is something called the Wellcome Trust UK. There's a charity organization, world's largest biomedical charity organization, and they started supporting researchers in India about 15 years ago. And since then, there has been a partnership between the Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, and the Wellcome Trust, who support a lot of people in the country. And every few years, now and then, Wellcome Trust comes back and says that now we would like to seize the support and Government of India should take over completely from us. And the last time it happened was about 10 years ago. I was still in Pune. And at that time, the Wellcome Trust team had come, and I got a chance in person to actually kind of tell them in a very harsh language that it's their moral duty to keep supporting Indian researchers for perpetuity. So that's what I told them, actually in these words, that is moral obligation that you cannot withdraw from countries like India because you have taken so much away from India. So that's the thing that I did. So last year, Wellcome Trust once again invited me to give a talk, and I thought it's no better occasion than reminding the Western audience about how much collaboration between the West and the East used to happen since the medieval times, since the ancient times, and how much that has benefited humanity. It's only after the colonial angle came in last about 200 years, that a group of people, individuals or the entire country started behaving as if they were superior to populations here. And that's very unfortunate because colonial occupation does not mean cultural superiority. Colonial occupation only meant administrative control that the colonial powers had. But that does not mean cultural superiority, and we of course are a very ancient culture and we have developed many things in our own ways. And they have benefited humanity in general. So I gave this talk to the Wellcome Trust team, and of course none of the people from US and UK were aware of the examples that I showed there, including a recent example, a TB drug that has been introduced in the market about 8 years ago. That drug was discovered in India, and there was a TB researcher in the audience, somebody called David Sherman, who has been a good friend of mine over the years. And David was not aware that it was discovered in India. He always thought it was discovered in US, so I had to actually correct him, telling him the first papers I will show you, and for everything that I show you now, there will be an evidence, historic evidence in either manuscripts or in archaeological evidences and something like that, and I am going to quote every example with proper scientific peer-reviewed evidences. So there is no room for people to come and criticize, saying that what you are talking is only glorifying India's history without any proper support for that. Now, those of you who are aware of history would know that India and China had a very strong trade with the Middle East and through that with Europe for a long time. And those of you who have kept up with literature would remember in the last about few months, there have been excavations that have been carried out in a place called Baranik in Egypt, and they are finding evidences from 3rd century of the trade between India and those places. And in fact, they have found Buddha's statue, which is about 2 feet tall, and they have found Sanskrit inscriptions, a gift from one of the Indian kings to one of the Middle East kings, and this is from 3rd century. So the trade between India and China and the East and West has been fairly strong. And in fact, most people believe that there is a route that goes from Indonesia all the way up to Egypt, what is called as the spice route, was more active than the route that goes from the north, what is called as the Silk route. The Silk route and spice route are the two traditional routes of the trade between different cultures, and the spice route was extraordinarily active. And that also actually means that Indians were very good in maritime trading. In fact, the art of shipbuilding is known to have emerged from India, making sail ships and so on and so forth. And as we speak today, Government of India is just in the process of making a good maritime museum in a place called Lothal in Gujarat. Lothal has the world's oldest record of a dockyard, where the ships could come and dock and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, so the idea is actually to tell you examples from Indian history in a very narrow area that I have chosen today, biomedical sciences, and to tell you how much benefit it has brought to humanity by exchange of thoughts between East and West. And this communication between East and West, the healthy exchange, it broke down in early 19th century, and since then, unfortunately, the colonial mindset has taken over, and even in our own country, we have started believing that the people in the West are more advanced in terms of their culture, in terms of their science and technology and so on and so forth. That's an unfortunate part that we have been made to believe that, but it's not the real truth. That's the thing that we'll actually try to see here. So that's the whole idea that what I'm going to talk about. So I will try to tell you a little bit about the medicinal practices in ancient India. I have chosen a few examples. I've just picked up random examples. There are many different examples. In fact, a full course of about 10 or 20 lectures can be given on this alone. What medicine practice in ancient India have been. I will also show you how healthy exchanges between the Europeans and Indians took place till about 19th century. Right? How people were exchanging ideas and how things were actually happening. I will come to notable contributions from India in the modern times, that is about last 100 years, and also talk a little bit about hospitals and colleges and so on and so forth. Now we go to the Vedic periods. The Vedic periods are very ancient periods, and one of the things that talks about is something called a Nasadiya Sukta. And if you talk of evolution, how life started evolving, the Nasadiya Sukta actually very explicitly says that we don't know how evolution began, how the life forms on the planet really came about. And even no one knows what was there before it, what covered it and so on and so forth. This is a very traditional Indian view of evolution. Right? On the other hand, the evolution first theories that were proposed in the West right? And one of the first evidences of proposal of evolution came from none other than Aristotle. And Aristotle believed that life emerges spontaneously in anywhere here, you know. So he was kind of a creationist, right? What today we call as a creationist, that if you leave some food outside or something, bugs will emerge spontaneously out of that. Now that's the theory of evolution that had been prevalent till Darwin came in about 19th century, mid 19th century, and debunked all of that. And Pasteur came and showed that life does not emerge spontaneously. The Pasteur and Darwin together debunked the theory that life emerges. But till then, the whole West believed that life emerges spontaneously. Now look at the contrast between the two. You know, I mean, we always believed that we don't know how life began, and there are other theories of how life actually started spreading over the planet, but something like that, differently. Now, for the medicines, we have the ancient Vedas, the 4 principal Vedas, and the Vedas describe about 300 different medicinal plants, right? I mean, there is a description of 300 plants, out of which 5 are considered to be very holy. We'll come to those 5 very holy plants described from there. And in the post-Vedic period, when we come closer, about 2000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, when we have these 2 major treatises that have been written. The Sushruta Samhita, which talks about surgery, a lot of it, and the Charaka Samhita, which talks about medicinal practices and so on and so forth. And many of the things that are prevalent even today, you know, the surgical practices prevalent today, you know, they actually have been described in great detail in Sushruta Samhita. And I'm going to show you one example of that. You know that even today, the best of the hospitals in the world, they use practices that have been described in Sushruta Samhita. Best of the hospitals, even in Harvard and Stanford and so on and so forth. And the holistic thing that emerges out of all the Vedas and the Sushruta and Charaka is essentially, from the Indian tradition, we believe that whole universe is made up of 5 essential elements, right? All of us know what these 5 elements are. That is Prithvi, Jal, Agni, Vayu and Akash, right? And they are depending upon what human senses are, whether you can see it, whether you can touch it, you can feel it, you can taste it and so on and so forth. And when we eventually go to Akash, there is something that you cannot touch, you cannot feel, you cannot see, or things like that. You know, and what we believe is that at any point of time in nature, there has to be a balance between these 5 elements. You know, that's basic Indian philosophy, is we have to maintain balance between the 5 elements. And at any point of time, there is an imbalance. There obviously will be ramifications of that, either on the environment or even on human health, human, plant, animal health. So we always consider health as a unified view of nature. So we have to be in harmony with entire thing, and we have to maintain balance between the 5 different elements. Only then we can actually lead healthy life or something like that is what we believe. And that philosophy has been perpetuated, stated again and again, multiple different times by different people who have come from our soil, including people like Gautam Buddha and all. They have actually perpetuated philosophies such as this and suggesting us to take the middle path and not to go any of the extremes to leave the balance and so on and so forth. And that eventually leads to Vata Pitta Kapha that all of you are aware of. Alright. Now come to examples, historical examples of how we treated the 5 elements and how we have actually treated health as an aspect of that. Now I will actually start coming to documentary evidences of what existed in this part of the world. Now this is one of the first evidences that comes from excavations in Mehergarh. Mehergarh is a few hundred kilometers north of Rawalpindi, you know, and is roughly about 6000 BC. So the dating is about 8000 years ago. That's one of the first settlements of humans when they came from Turkey. Turkey is one of the most ancient settlements of humans when humans moved out of Africa. But when we started forming colonies and all, in our neighborhood, we have, in the larger Indian map, you would see the first settlements in this particular area. And this is an evidence of how dental surgeries used to be performed. I showed you Vedas. Vedas have actually been written around those times, and they have described how actually to do things. A dental surgery from bones which are excavated from Mehergarh, right? And this is a paper which describes that. All right, and they found out a few skeletons from there, and from the 9 adult skeletons, they have found evidence for 11 drilled molar crowns, and the drilling is in the first or the second molar, and the holes are about 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter, right? And this is a definite evidence that dental surgeries used to be performed. In fact, Sushruta goes on describing many other surgeries, including cataract and all, but there is an evidence for dental. And literature is abundant on this. This is only one of the papers that I am showing you here. This is 2006, but literature is abundant on how dental surgeries used to be performed on this. This is the first set of examples. I thought I will tell you that we begin from roughly 6000 BC. Now, when the Europeans started arriving here in the 15th century, even before that, there was a very strong trade between Middle East and India. But the first of the sea route across the South Africa, across the Africa, Vasco da Gama, when he arrived here, sometimes in the late 15th century, there are a lot of exchanges that took place between Europeans and Indians, especially in the medicinal practices. And both of us were learning from each other how things were. And this actually I want to quote a few examples of that, how that happened. So, what was known to Indians, for example, in Sushruta, and this is one of the first examples of a very healthy exchange that took place between British and Indians. And if somebody's nose is severe, so what Indians used to do is reconstruct the nose by using the skin on the forehead or on the cheek. That's what we call as plastic surgery. Now, today, if you look at, read newspapers who are critical of people like me, would say when we say that plastic surgery used to happen in India, and the newspapers which belong to a particular ideology, they would criticize people like me, would do it without any evidence. What we are presenting here is the evidence that plastic surgery did indeed exist in India, and Sushruta was a master of that. It is part of plastic surgery, what we call as rhinoplasty. It's not exactly plastic surgery, but rhinoplasty that existed. And the way to construct a nose was take a piece of leaf, put it on the nose, which is severe, cut the leaf in the shape of the nose, put that shape either here or here, excise that part of the skin, flip it, put it on the nose, and to remain the nostrils open, you insert 2 sticks so that the nostrils remain open and then paste it. It takes about 15 days to 2 to 3 weeks for this to heal, and the nose gets reconstructed in complete entirety. So this is the procedure that has been described in Sushruta Samhita. In 1793, right, when the British East India Company was trying to put its foothold in India, they had a base in Pune. They had yet not defeated the Marathas. The Marathas were the rulers of the country at that particular point of time. Unfortunately, the Maratha history is not taught as much as what we need to do. We are more taught about the Mughal history and the lineage in Mughals, but we are not taught of Maratha history, which is an unfortunate part in our historical texts. But the Marathas were ruling India over at that particular point of time, from north to south. And the East India Company went to war with Tipu Sultan in Mysore in 1793. And the troops went from Pune to fight the war in Mysore. One of the bullock cart drivers was a person, now I forget his name. Yeah, I think this name will come back to me. Kausaji was his name. Kausaji is the person who was the bullock cart driver. British lost the war. 1793 they lost the war. They eventually won against Tipu Sultan in 1797. But 1793 war, Kausaji came back with a severed nose. And when he came back, of course, Britishers did not have a remedy for that. But there's a barber sitting under a tree in Pune, performed rhinoplasty on Kausaji. And that was watched by a host of British doctors surrounding Kausaji and how the surgery was being done. A number of British doctors actually watched the surgery in action. It was taken back to London. It was presented in the Royal College of Surgeons, right? In the early 18th century, the entire account of how rhinoplasty is done in India was presented to Royal College of Surgeons, and there is a document for that. And 1814, a doctor called Joseph Carpue performed the first plastic surgery in a hospital at York in Chelsea on His Majesty's Army man. And Joseph Carpue records that he has followed the procedure that was done in Pune. Right? He has followed exactly the same procedure and said that the entire procedure took about 15 minutes. In that 15 minutes, this person under whom the surgery was performed was under great pain. Of course, Carpue did not know what the pain relievers in India were. The pain relievers in India essentially were cannabis derived, and I will come to cannabis little later. And what is recorded is that the reconstructed node had every appearance of a natural nose, and the forehead took about 3 months to heal. So skin was actually taken away from here. So this is now an evidence that is recorded in history in learned societies that the procedure was learned from India and taken there. Minor variant of that is operating even today. Anywhere you go in Bangalore, and if somebody does a reconstructive rhinoplasty on any person that you know of, this is the procedure that would be followed. There are minor variants. Nobody would take a leaf anymore, and for sealing, something else would be done. There also you would get possibly immunosuppressants and things like that. You would be given plenty of painkillers. There's a modern day. But the essential practice has remained the same over the years. And this picture of Kausaji is taken none other than the Wellcome Library collection. So I wanted to actually show the Wellcome Trust that I am taking evidences from your own library and presenting to you. This is one of the first things that I actually did there. Alright. Now, the fascination for the Western people for India was always very high. And there are many people who actually tried to attempt documenting Indian knowledge. Right? The Western people who tried to document Indian knowledge. And one of the first persons who did that was a Portuguese governor. Right? And his name is Garcia de Horta. In about 16th century, early 16th century, he was based in Bombay and later on in Ahmednagar. And in Nagar, he actually came and did a lot of survey. And then he wrote down a treatise, which is actually one of the very classical treatise on medicinal plants in India. It was actually published at that time, and it was translated in about 20 different languages in Europe. This particular treatise. How medicinal plants are useful, how Indians have documented the use of medicinal plants is essentially this particular treatise. And among the side stories of this is that Europeans used to believe that tamarind grows on a palm tree. So he dismissed that myth, saying that tamarind actually grows on a tamarind tree, not on a palm tree. So one of the things that also he records in his book. So the thing is, there was a very healthy respect for our culture, for our practices, and trying to learn from each other how we do treat different people and things like that. It was existing, the colonialism had yet not started. One of the things he records also is that the botanical treatment for snake bite is from Dhatura. That's also is recorded in this particular book. And it's a very classical textbook. It's available even today. The translations of this are available even today. Another attempt was made, right, and this is sometimes about 1750s, by a person, a Dutch governor called Hendrik van Riet. Now there are plant people here, right? Some people who work on plant biology here. Nobody works on plant biology here? Yeah. Now, all of you are aware that the binary name that is given to the species, Homo sapiens for example, Homo and sapiens, all of you are aware of that, right? That name comes from Carl Linnaeus, right? It's called a Linnean name, correct? Linnaeus was one of the first persons who tried to systematically categorize different organisms, right? I mean, the categorization and organization of biological systems was Linnaeus. This is 30 years before Linnaeus. The first systematic attempt to categorize plants in different categories and varieties was the first such this thing. And that was done by Hendrik van Riet, who was the Dutch governor in Kerala. And he took help of an Ayurvedic physician in Kerala, somebody called Itti Achyutan. And together they went across Kerala on feet. They traversed entire coast on the west coast, and they documented every plant that they came across and the medicinal use of that plant in Ayurveda has been described. And that led to a classical text called Hortus Mulbaricus. This precedes Linnaeus. Right? Remember, this Carl Linnaeus' classifications is much before that, 30 years before that. And about 100 years ago, this was actually translated, it was discovered once again and has been translated and actually put there together. So, once again to say that Hendrik van Riet, just like the Orta, they were both fascinated and they were aware of the practices that happened here, right? And they were actually quite respectful of those practices. The third example, and this is the last example I will give you from our ancient practices, is something called variolation. Throughout the centuries, the major killers, right, apart from wars and famines, of course, the major killers were things like plague. Right, the plague was one of the major killers, but there was also smallpox and there was also tuberculosis. And by something like 15th and 16th century, smallpox had started overtaking plague and TB as one of the major killers around the world. Right? The smallpox had become a real issue all over the world. And in about 18th century, Europeans realized that India has a practice to avoid smallpox deaths. Alright? And that is through a practice of variolation. Now in literature, there is still being debated whether variolation was invented in India or China, right? But India and China were very close in exchanging information, but nonetheless, we can consider ourselves at two coins of the same culture. So, when smallpox had become a leading cause of the death, and there was an epidemic in 1721 in England, the doctors who were actually aware of the practice in India and China, they came here and studied the practice of variolation. Now, how was variolation done in India? So, smallpox used to actually have outbreaks in particular seasons, right? Sometimes in March, sometimes in September, where the kind of seasons just before the onset of summer and during monsoon, for whatever reason, smallpox there used to be outbreaks. And then learned people from Banaras would come. These people would carry inoculation on sticks, pointed sticks with them. The inoculation would be from people who already had smallpox. Those who had smallpox, they would actually pick there and bring those sticks with them. Now, those who wanted to be variolated, those who wanted to be protected against smallpox, had to follow particular diet for about a month. They were not allowed to have ghee, they were not allowed to have curd, they were not allowed to eat fish, and so on and so forth. And these learned people from Banaras would go all over the country, and those who had followed the practice very strictly for a month, they would go and inoculate them. Right? So they would actually take a piece of cloth, rub on the skin for about 15 minutes. Now the skin would actually get inflamed, you would get a red patch there, and there they would actually pick from the sticks that they were carrying, inoculate they would carry. What was the effect? The mortality because of variolation was about 1 to 2% in India, those who had variolated, and if they contracted smallpox, the mortality rate was 1 to 2%, as against 30% mortality rate in Europe. Mortality rate, so people who would be contracting smallpox, in India only 1% of them died, in Europe 30% of them died. Moreover, there were certain side effects, but just like smallpox, variolation also conferred lifelong protection. And also, disfigurement was much less. Smallpox, you get disfigurement, the parts of the body, that was much less. Who would present it to the Britishers? There's a person called Joseph Phule, right? This person, who was a doctor and who was a survivor of a very famous tragedy in Calcutta, what is called as the Black Hole. There's a very famous historical battle that was fought in Calcutta just after a few years after the Plassey battle. And Phule noted the practice how variolation was done. He went, and I think in 1767, correct. In 1767, he made a presentation to the Fellow of Royal Society, to the College of Physicians in Royal Society. And he's recorded once again, documented his presentation, the entire practice of variolation. And Europeans started adopting this particular practice then, UK people. Because they had still not formed a full colony. We are still in early part of East India Company trying to spread its wings in India. And they were actually very kind of surprised by this. Unfortunately, right? Of course, fortunately, to some extent, that Edward Jenner came up with the vaccine in 1797. Now remember, this is 30 years before that. Right? Edward Jenner came with the vaccine. The unfortunate part of that, by then the East India Company had started making farm food in India, and they insisted that everyone would get vaccinated by Jenner vaccine and not by this method. And Indians saying that we have been doing it for ages, why should we actually take Jenner's vaccine? And we would actually continue with this particular practice. And that created the first conflict between the East and the West in biomedical practices. So the first of the conflicts that we can actually record was because of this. But there were more serious conflicts to follow, and we'll come to those. So, the practice of vaccination or variolation in this case was known, and that had brought down considerable sufferings to Indian people earlier. And is one of the things that was realized in Europe by that. So I want to actually come back to how the conflict actually then started escalating and what eventually led to total domination by the colonial powers on us, on our minds, and so on and so forth. But before that, let us look at some examples from modern medicine. And once again, I will come back to this particular topic, that how the conflicts came. So when we come to modern era, one of the foremost names in modern era is of course Praful Chandra Rai. All of you have heard of Acharya Praful Chandra Rai. He was a chemist. He is very famous for making things like mercury nitrate or something. He was educated in Edinburgh. He came back to India, and when he came back to India, he founded Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals in 1901. That's the first attempt to have a modern pharmaceutical company in India. He was, of course, a very staunch nationalist. He was a staunch promoter of Swadeshi movement, and he also tried to resist the colonial feeling that everything that we are learning today is only from the Europeans and not otherwise. And he wanted to counter that particular narrative that large knowledge existed in India. And for that, he wrote a very classical book. It's available on Amazon even today. Those of you who want to buy this, it's a very fascinating book, The History of Hindu Chemistry. Right? And he wrote this particular book saying that chemistry was very well known in India, and he has documented the entire history of chemistry that happened in India in this particular book. But I said, Praful Chandra is, of course, is an extraordinarily respected name in India's independence movement, and also in the social transformations and so on and so forth. So he was the first persons who started contributing to modern area of biomedicines. If you come closer to time, 1940s, 1950s, one of the foremost names is that of Colonel Ramnath Chopra. Colonel Ramnath Chopra was one of the finest physicians that country has produced. He wrote down in 1942-1943 what is today called as the Drugs and Cosmetics Acts of India. So today what the Drugs and Cosmetics Acts of India that exists owes its origin to Ramnath Chopra, and CDSCO and DCGI and all are essentially offshoots of that particular one. Trials on a particular plant, and he actually developed a drug called Reserpine out of proper randomized controlled trials. He actually did double-blinded, and he showed that this particular drug had hypotensive activity. So if you have high blood pressure, if you take this, it will bring the blood pressure down. That's how this one was done. Of course, he didn't do much more beyond this particular one. But the people who started studying this particular drug in more depth, inspired by the work of Ramnath Chopra and people like Brody and Carlson, they also discovered that this is also a neurotransmitter. And they discovered the first neurotransmitter, and they actually went on to win Nobel Prize for this particular discovery from Reserpine. Right, so Reserpine was used until very recently, but Reserpine unfortunately has a side effect that it gives some kind of it depletes serotonin from the brain, and therefore Reserpine is not used anymore. But this was the first randomized clinical trial that happened in India. So many times you will get to hear criticism that no modern drug has been discovered in India. Right? I mean, the people who do not know about India's history would, and they would write typically in newspapers like of The Wire or things like that, that India has not discovered any drug in modern times. You have to counter that, saying that India did indeed perform randomized clinical trials, and there were drugs which were in international market from the randomized clinical trials that happened in India, and it's a very fine example of that, this particular one. Research. I'm going to give you some more example of that particular one. This is Upendranath Brahmachari. All of you have heard his name. UN Brahmachari was working on Kala Azar. There was a devastating disease especially in the eastern part of the country. There was only 90%, there's only 10% survival rate, 90% mortality rate by people who were affected by leishmaniasis. And he actually introduced a drug called ureastibamine, and this is his own hand-drawn graph that between 1925 and 1935, the number of deaths that have come down from here to here because of the use of ureastibamine. And it's another drug that was introduced in Indian market and had helped medicine so much. And historically, this is only the second anti-infective after salvarsan, even before penicillin was discovered. So ureastibamine was discovered in 1920s or 1930s and has actually helped bringing down the mortality very much. In the post-independent times, we have of course the examples of Shekhar Mande. I don't want to go into the details of this, who discovered the clinical manifestation of cholera. Shekhar Mande was nominated for Nobel Prize by none other than Joshua Ladybug 5 times and very richly deserved to get Nobel Prize. But there is a serious conflict between the West and the East even today, and he didn't actually quite get it. But the example that I actually thought I will tell you a little bit is a drug called pretomanid. This drug was introduced in the world market about 8 years ago, right? So this is a class of compounds called nitroimidazoles. Okay, so this is the basic backbone of that particular compound, and it's a derivative of that. So this drug was actually synthesized for the first time by one of the finest medicinal chemists in the country, somebody called Nagarajan. Unfortunately, many of you would not have heard of Nagarajan. He passed away in Bangalore about a year ago at the age of 96. He was working in the Ciba Geigy Research Park in Mumbai most of his career, and in fact all his accolades that he got was from his work in the Ciba Geigy pharmaceutical company. One of the very rare individuals working in a private company. He was then awarded Shantisuru Bhatnagar Prize. He was fellow of all the academies and so on and so forth. He is an extremely well recognized person in medicinal chemistry. But he had discovered these drugs, and it is described in 1980s, 1982, 1983 is the first paper in which he described the synthesis of this. And then he conducted trials on mice and guinea pigs. Whether they can be cleared of TB. And the preclinical trials actually showed that mice were cleared of TB because of this one. And this was in the late 1980s. It was not known, once again, to the Western world. And a company in Seattle called Pathogenesis in 1995, for the first time, they synthesized this compound. They got into clinical trial. It was called as PA824. Those who work on TB would know the name PA824. So PA824 was brought in clinical trials by the Global Alliance, and eventually, after all the clinical trials and all, this drug has come into the market. But it was first described in literature in 1980s, and this is the drug that actually I told David Sherman last year in the Wellcome Trust meeting that it was discovered in India, and he said he was not aware of this. He always thought it was discovered in Seattle. So we'll have to keep talking about this. And Nagarajan, in his review much later, he noted that if any one of these two, that is either this or this, succeeds in clinical usage, the scientists of the Goregaon Research Center, their wishes can be assumed to be fulfilled. Now, unfortunately for Ciba-Geigy Foundation, they closed their research park after this early analysis of this particular one. Otherwise, Ciba-Geigy itself could have introduced this in India or later. This drug could have come much ahead of time had Ciba-Geigy continued his research in Gurgaon in those times. A second aspect of this, and I was not aware of this till about a month ago, on the 5th August I was giving a talk in ISER Trivandrum, and I showed this particular example. And there is a person, a very fine chemist of modern generation, somebody called Kanna Sureshan. I don't know how many of you have met him. So Kanna Sureshan is a very fine organic chemist. And he said that the synthetic process for this drug was very expensive and not very convenient. And there was a global challenge that was launched, that who can come up with a very efficient synthetic process. And Kanna Sureshan actually participated in that, and he won a global prize for that. So on today's date, the drug is synthesized using Sureshan's method in this particular drug. So you have two connections with India. One, it was first discovered in Mumbai, and second, the drug that sells in the market all over the world today is synthesized using Sureshan's synthetic process. So both are actually very happy coincidences. I talked a little bit about cannabis. I want to say that cannabis is actually a wonderful plant. I don't know how many of you have consumed it. It's very interesting experience after you consume cannabis. In the north, typically during holy time, there is very wide use of cannabis during the holy times. But apart from the other effects, the hallucinations and all those things, it has very strong medicinal properties. So cannabis has two major components, right? Something called a THC and something called a CBD. CBD is the cannabinoids which have medicinal properties. THC is the one which has addictive property. So the plants which are low in THC but high in CBD are very good for medicinal usage. And Indian texts describe 5 principal plants, the holy plants, and cannabis is one of them. So cannabis has been used extensively in India for a long time for its medicinal usage, and especially the cannabinoids, low THC cannabinoids. Now India came under tremendous pressure in 1985. The then government, despite having a brutal majority, came under tremendous pressure from the US, and therefore India banned cultivation and use of cannabis, 1985. And I think that was one of the most regressive steps and kind of yielding to the wishes of the countries that we should not have done in 1985. Today, right about 40 years later, all the countries who put pressure on India to ban cannabis, they themselves are giving permission to legalize cannabis in their country. On today's date, most of the countries around the world have come back and saying that cannabis should be legalized for cultivation because it has good medicinal properties. And one of my achievements when I was in Delhi was something which I am very proud of, is actually get the purified cannabinoids in proper randomized clinical trials, RCTs, double-blinded. And we did that about 4 years ago. We actually approached the Tata Memorial Hospital in Delhi, TMC, and we said that patients who are terminal and who are in enormous pain, we can conduct trials on them to relieve their pain. And cannabis is one of the most effective painkillers. Cannabinoids are most effective painkillers. And these clinical trials are actually going on as we speak today. So this is one of the things that we did is we want to bring cannabinoids in clinic because of their properties of this particular extent. And they have been described, as I said, in the Vedas once again, and use of this has been described, and therefore we must not actually forget that there is some useful knowledge that exists from the ancient texts and so on and so forth. Now I don't want to go further, I will actually going to skip this particular one. I just want to mention one short point, is that the conflicts in the East and the West, they began, as I said, with the vaccines. The first of the conflicts in biomedical sciences is because of vaccines versus virulation. But a major conflict came when the colonial powers thought that their education system was superior to our education system, and it was thought that the education must be in English and not in other languages. And there were specific statements made by multiple people. Some of the worst statements that you would have heard were from people like Macaulay, who actually tried to degrade or degenerate India's education system. Until then, the Indian medical practices were being taught in 3 languages, in Sanskrit, in Urdu, and in English. All the medical education was carried out in 3 languages, right? But the moment the colonial mindset and the arrogance of colonialism took over, we were asked to stop teaching in Sanskrit and Urdu. And that made us completely subservient to the education system of the West that we have followed today. And I do hope that Chanakya reverses that particular trend and comes back to our own classical education system, which we believe, if it's not better, at least equal to any other education systems in the world. So it's firmly rooted in Indian values and systems, is what we actually want to come back once again. So this is the conflict where actually the breaking point came, and then we were told at this particular point that we were kind of an inferior population, and since then, this is roughly about 1813, 1814, around that particular point of time, 1835, and this is principally because of Macaulay, and this 200 years since then, unfortunately we have suffered to the colonial mindset. It's only now that we are trying to resurrect ourselves, thanks to the sustained effort by even many of us are undertaking, talking about it at international platforms, talking about it in India and everywhere, that we have to have our society which is firmly rooted in our own culture, in our history and our practices. If you do that, I don't think we are inferior to anyone else as we have been made to believe in the last 200 years. I'm going to skip this. So what actually I have told you in the last 45 minutes or so is that we have had a very rich tradition in biomedical practices. I can go on giving many different kinds of examples. I have chosen only a few examples of that to show it to you. I could have shown you an example of how cataract was being performed in Sushruta's time. I could have showed you many other things, but I thought I will show you only some representative examples. The conflict between the West and the East began early in the 19th century because of colonial occupation and the arrogance of colonial powers. This is the essence of the breaking down of communication between the East and the West. Once the arrogance of the ruling powers took over, we became completely subservient to the Western system. But we still today have much to learn from each other. On today's date, if we have developed a healthy respect for each other, about the intellect of both East and the West, and accept the fact that all of us can contribute to the betterment of humanity together, I think there is a scope for escalating the pace of that particular thing once again. And in that particular respect, the World Health Organization has recently set up an institute for traditional medicine in Jamnagar, and I think this is a very welcome step. And as we speak once again, this year, in the National Institute of Health budget, a substantial provision has been made for understanding the traditional practices in the US. And the World Health Organization and many European agencies are making effort as we speak today of trying to understand traditional tribal practices also in the Africas. Right? And that I think is a healthy step. Because all over the world, different communities have developed their own practices, different communities have developed their own culture, and all the practices and cultures, they are not based on blind faith as we have been told in last 200 years. There is no blind faith in that. These practices have evolved through learnings of many different generations. And the practices have been passed on from generation to generation orally. We have learned it from our parents have learned it from their parents, and so on and so forth. Right? And there is a lot of healthy learning to be done from these practices. And last couple of years have seen a good positive trend even in the West trying to accept the fact that tribals and ancient cultures like China and India have much to offer to the world for betterment of humanity and for betterment of our planet. So this is essentially what I wanted to tell you. I will end my talk by thanking Dr. Anand Deshpande of Persistent, who supports me these days. I mean, he has given a very generous philanthropic grant to Pune University, and I get my salary out of that particular one. I also get JC Bose Fellowship from Department of Science and Technology, and I am hosted in these two institutes together today. Thank you.
Providing us insights into the Indian biomedical science heritage. If you have questions, you can go ahead and ask.
So I'm from mathematics, so I'd like to ask you a very bad question. So some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a Chinese physician or scientist. She was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for what I might call Chinese Ayurveda modernized into a drug. You will sharpen what I'm saying. So what are our chances of doing the same with our Indian Ayurveda, and will this new center help? And can you please elaborate on what I'm trying to recall?
Yes. So there's a lady whose name I think is Yu Wu or something like that. She was working on what is called as traditional Chinese medicine or TCM, and there is a remedy in the traditional Chinese medicine on malaria from correct, and she derived this particular compound from the plants, and this compound is used in anti-malaria therapy even today. So,
can you please repeat your point?
So this lady, Wu Yu, I mean, just correct my name, I am not getting the name correctly. A plant called artemisinin, and then she purified a compound called artemisinin and showed that it has proper anti-malarial activity. This drug is used even today all over the world for malaria. So basically that comes from traditional Chinese medicine or what we call TCMs. Now attempts, thankfully what has happened is that it required a thinking change in India, right? I mean, we have been dominated by a different kind of thinking in the last 70 odd years, but it required a change in the thinking pattern in the last few years, and the government has now acknowledged, the current government acknowledges that India's traditional system has been very strong, And in fact, the current government also set up a new ministry called Ministry of Ayush. In 2014, November 2014, the new Ministry of Ayush was set up. And it has given some respectability at least now. And Ministry of Ayush is now making very specific efforts in trying to validate India's traditional knowledge. I think a lot more needs to be done than what Ministry of Ayush is doing today. But at least that thinking is coming into the mainstream. What was actually taken off the mainstream all these years, for last 200 years, but is coming back, and hopefully in the next 30-40 years we will see actually more and more traditional Indian medicine being validated, and if it is validated, it can be also be put in use in the modern kind of perspective.
Any other question?
So you talked about rhinoplasty and vaccination in ancient India. Can you suggest some textbook which documents this? Is there any textbook available, or is it from research articles?
A lot of it is from research articles, but people like, I don't know, you have heard of Professor Valiathan. He just passed away a month ago. Professor Valiathan has documented a lot of it in his books. So Indian National Science Academy brought out several books on history of science in India, and Professor Valiathan has written about biomedical sciences in that particular, those books. But a lot of it is from research articles, these ones. The photographs and some of the rhinoplasty literature I have taken from Wellcome Trust collection. So Wellcome
the presentation so that I can have a look at the references.
Yeah. So Wellcome Trust, if you happen to visit London, go to their museum and you will see some of these being displayed there. Or Wellcome Trust library, Wellcome Trust also has an exhibit in multiple science museums in the country. I believe it would be there also in the Vishwesvaraya Museum. So there would be a section on Indian medicine in Vishwesvaraya Museum. I'm sure they will have these kind of photographs kept in.
So is there any research or those things are going on to document those informations you already have? Like you're saying, most of the documentations of the information was in Sanskrit or something, but some information was like orally from generation to generations. So is there any initiatives regarding those things? It's difficult to get those
Yes.
like orally, but that tradition is still there. So is there any attempt for the research of those?
So as I said, in biomedicine, Ministry of Ayush is making definite attempt to try to validate and document India's traditional knowledge. But biomedicine is only, as I said in the beginning, one very narrow aspect that I talked about. Indian knowledge system has been extraordinarily rich in fields like mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and so on and so forth. And in fact, tomorrow I am giving a talk in IISc. I'll be talking a little bit, very briefly, about India's metallurgy and so on and so forth. How lost facts technique, there's something called lost facts techniques in making statues and all, has been used in India for the last 8,000 years. Even today it is used. So there is a continuous practice. Even today, statues from alloys are made from lost wax. That was invented in India. So there is an effort that is going on, but a lot more needs to be done. Our literature is so rich. When other day, when was this? 17th August, right? So few days ago, I had a chance to be with Dr. Vivek Debroy. He is a person who is the chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. And Vivek also is a very well-known scholar in translating ancient Sanskrit texts into English. I think he has translated Skanda Puranam or something like that. What Vivek was saying on that day was, there are millions of texts that exist. Okay? Many of them have been written in Sanskrit, but not Devanagari, probably written in Prakrit script. Right? And they need to be translated. Because to make any sense out of that, first we need to translate them so that people can actually understand what is written in that text, and millions of them. We have focused our attention, according to him, only on Upanishads or on Gita and things like that, and maybe Arthashastra or something like that. But we need to do lot more in translating those texts. And if we are able to do that, and if we are able to actually make sense out of it, like what people like Vivek are doing, and he actually interprets them in a very nice, positive way. So the interpretation, if there is brought out, I think we have a lot to benefit from our ancient things. And Government of India is doing some efforts in this direction, but the efforts are at least million times less than what they ought to be. So we will have to actually generate probably a mass movement in which people learn Sanskrit or ancient texts, they learn to read Prakrit, and many people actually undertake this as a community exercise in translating texts and so on and so forth. First of all, we have to be actually proud of our culture and heritage. This is number one. So we have to actually shed the colonial hangover that we are inferior to others. This is number one. Number two, once we believe in ourselves, then we have to actually start converting our texts into more palatable.
Okay, if there are no questions, I request Mr. Subramanian to hand over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.